A 60-year union that appears to be on something of a shaky ground. Is the EU simply holding on by a thread? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Euroscepticism, anti-establishment parties, and of course Brexit. The European Union is no longer a place of mutual understanding and shared goals. Some say the euro is the only thing holding it together. Is that enough? It was formed to prevent another world war.
We cannot aim at anything less than the union of Europe as a whole.
The European Union offered solidarity, a plan for lasting peace and prosperity. But 60 years on, are the ties that bind it unravelling?
We've got our country back!
Brexit, the rise of the far right, and separatist movements within the EU are seen as destabilising influences. Are they powerful enough to undermine the EU to the point of disintegration? It has the world's largest single market. It is the world's second largest economy, with the combined economic might of its member countries. It is a force in world politics, using its influence in important global issues, from Iran's nuclear deal to climate change policy. Committed to the advancement of peace, the EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. But within its own walls, rumblings of discontent are threatening to boil over. Euroscepticism is picking away at the idea of the European Union as a close-knit unit. Greece's crippling austerity, Brexit, and the refugee crisis have galvanized EU populism. The EU's been called a club of, quote, unelected elites, imposing bureaucratic policies.
Identitás kérdését tartom közép-európaiként a legfontosabbnak. És a migráció pont ezzel a kérdéssel függ össze. Ne csináljunk olyan európai migrációs politikát, ez a magyar álláspont, aminek eredményeképpen mi többé nem leszünk azok, akik most vagyunk.
It's been suggested that Italy, Poland and Hungary may follow Britain's lead in exiting the EU. In Austria, the anti-EU Freedom Party, which has Nazi roots, is now in parliament, a feat that has been praised by other far-right EU parties.
Let that be an example for all the political elite that it's much wiser to work together to achieve good policies and strengthen our border and diminish the immigration and be tougher on crime and everything that is happening in Austria today.
Waves of anti-EU sentiment are building up behind the immigration issue. More than 10 parties from 10 different countries say they want to bring down the EU bloc.
Coraz więcej znaków na niebie i ziemi w regulacjach poszczególnych państw oraz w wyborach narodów, poszczególnych społeczeństw wskazuje na to, że ten problem migracji będzie bardzo gorący, ale że ta wskazówka przesuwa się w kierunku.
A tale of two Europes, one of peace and unity, and one of discord. Can the EU harmonise its divisions, or will it gradually unravel? And I'm pleased to say that joining us for this roundtable via satellite from Brussels, we have Pieter Cleppe, who's head of the Brussels office of Open Europe, a think tank focusing on Britain's new relationship with the European Union. Julia Himmrich from the London School of Economics. She's part of the Dahrendorf Forum, researching the future of Europe, and Russell Foster, a European Union affairs analyst at King's College London. Analysis, that's a great way to start. I should have said analyst, Russell. So let me start with you. So first of all, with an apology, and secondly, with what dangers, other than Brexit and the far-right parties. What dangers do you think the European Union is really facing?
At the moment, it seems that the European Union is in the eye of the storm. It's survived Brexit, it's survived the refugee crisis, it seems to have survived the 2017 surge in nationalism and Euroscepticism. But even though these issues aren't in the news at the minute, doesn't mean that they've gone away. Since 2005, we've seen the Union lurching from one crisis to another, and this has accelerated since 2014 with the return of a very Eurosceptic European Parliament, a Eurozone crisis, a migration crisis. Brexit hasn't happened yet, and when it does happen, it will impact the Union just as much as it impacts the United Kingdom. So we can anticipate in the next few years the problems that we've seen since 2014 are going to return in the form of disillusioned populations and external crises.
And do you believe that the foundations have been disturbed by this and that the Union is weaker as a result of it? So when these problems return, it won't have the strength that it had before?
It's been severely weakened. The European project since the end of the Second World War has been predicated upon shared goals, shared values, and coming together in the face of external threats, be they diplomatic or economic. What we're now seeing is an increasing lack of faith among European citizens that the European Union can protect them and their interests. This is why we're seeing a return to nationalism and also a return to ethnic nationalism and separatism.
Interesting to hear your concerns, because I know you are, if you like, almost pro-European.
I am, yes.
In this regard. We should point that out. Julia, the problems outlined there by Russell, are they difficulties that you also see?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree that I don't think that the issues underlying the big crisis of the last decade, I would say even, have gone away. I'm sure they're going to return. I think what is going to be the most important aspect in the next couple of years is really to rebuild the confidence in the institutions and into the political elites. And that's not just in Brussels, I would say even in the capitals and the member states. Because even though we've obviously seen with Brexit that people were tired of the establishment and the Eurocrats in Brussels, they're just as tired of their national politicians. So I think generally in Europe we have a crisis when it comes to really trusting in the political process. And now we need to see how is the EU going to actually respond to that.
You see, one of the difficulties I see is that all of the problems are out there on the front pages, the middle pages, the headlines, wherever. But any of the good work that the European Union does is pretty much hidden. Therefore, to rebuild confidence in something you cannot see is going to be difficult.
Yeah, I think you've definitely seen a lot of efforts from Brussels basically highlighting that they want to put these concerns of the people front and center and really show the added value of the EU in responding to that. So there are issues such as migration, of course. They are trying to work on a new framework for that over the next year. There's the issue of the idea that we need to reform the Eurozone, as well as when it comes to security and defense. But these things take time, and you're absolutely right that it's difficult to satisfy people that want some kind of quick fix right now.
Peter, in Brussels, I don't know whether you share the same feelings of the two guests we've just spoken to, but if you do or don't, please say so. But I'm wondering where you think some of the problems have come from.
What we see is that after Brexit, there are two possible reactions that the EU could have. On the one hand, you have people who say, well, the British are gone, let's now double down on all the things that we've been trying to do, which of course always come down to the same thing, which is to concentrate more money and more power at the Brussels level. On the other hand, you have people who, in my opinion, rightly say that the British have just left the club because they think the club is too overbearing, is micromanaging, and therefore the club should focus on its core business. And that core business is of course to open up trade, to scrap national protectionism and not to organize massive transfers or massive interventions into domestic policy. So the two camps are basically struggling at the moment, and especially Emmanuel Macron, the French president, is among those who believes that Brexit should be used to double down on the old agenda that has already provoked so much opposition.
We have an expression.
I think that's a very dangerous path, and it could lead to the collapse of the EU ultimately.
Well, we'll get into that in just a second. We have a phrase here. You don't hear it very much these days, which is that somebody or something is too big for his or her own boots. In other words, they've just sort of got a little bit too self-important. Is that what you mean when you talk about the EU being overbearing, interfering, or at least perceived to be interfering?
Yes, absolutely. As President Trump has just said, the EU isn't cracked up what it's, or isn't all that what it's cracked up to be. And indeed, the EU wants to pretend it is a superpower with a foreign ministry, but in reality, nobody really cares. The EU wants to sort of impose budgetary measures, but the member states don't really care. However, the EU is organizing transfers and thereby is really provoking a lot of anger in the countries that have to pay for that, whereas the countries that are receiving the transfers don't like the fact that they have to respect all the conditions linked
Just
to
help me with a little bit here. What do you mean by transfers?
Teams of officials.
Peter, what precisely do you mean by transfers?
Well, on the one hand, of course, you have the transfers within the EU budget. The EU budget is close to €1,000 billion over 7 years. And then much more importantly, we have the transfers at the Eurozone level, which have also involved the European Commission as the enforcer of the conditions linked to the transfers here. We have this massive Eurozone bailout fund, €500 billion, some other schemes. Also at the ECB level, a lot of stealth transfers have been introduced, enormous operations.
So it's the money going out rather than any particular money coming in, and where
keeping interest rate low
and where it goes to. Peter, back to you in just a moment. Either of you two here, the word collapse was mentioned by Peter. Gosh, that's wow. What do you think?
Yeah, I have to say, when I hear the word collapse, I'm wondering what that's supposed to look like sometimes. I think it's absolutely true that there is a risk to the current or the order that we're used to in the West in general, and the EU is clearly part of that. But if we're talking about a collapse of the EU, does that mean that in case other member states leave, everything's going to fall apart? I don't think so. I think there will still be, there's still quite a few member states that are very committed to the European project. So I'm struggling sometimes to understand if we're thinking about these big collapsing scenarios, are we maybe just exaggerating and just overemphasizing?
Are you suggesting perhaps, and please tell me if I'm wrong, I'm not trying to put words into your mouth, that the core members, some of the founding members, the French, the Germans, the Italians, etc., the big countries, industrialized countries, would remain as the centre, the kernel of the European Union, and countries that either consider their needs aren't being served or are considered to be peripheral, maybe the newest members, would just say that's it, or would there be a second-tier Europe?
Well, I'm not trying to predict how this collapse could look like, but I think that even in France and Italy, where we've seen very strong Eurosceptic movement, especially with Le Pen or with the Movimento 5 Stelle in Italy, we see that even they, eventually when it comes to a referendum on the euro, for example, kind of step back and actually backtrack of what they had argued. So we see, even in Le Pen was incredibly strong in France. We only think about Macron's success now, but actually it was a very tense campaign at the time. So we shouldn't underestimate the Euroscepticism even in France. But I still think that even the Eurosceptics in a country like France that could really make a difference are more careful than we think at the moment. And so I don't think in France or Italy, in Germany even less, there is really an appetite to see a collapse of the European Union.
Okay, one more question about perhaps where it went wrong, Russell, and then from everybody here, suggestions as to how to remedy the situation and whether in fact it's worth saving. So where do you think the real problems began, and are they as disastrous as the picture just painted by these other?
I think the problems are very real, and it is a very unsettling scenario now. I think the EU is hanging by a thread because it is now very vulnerable to external and internal crises emerging. For me, the current systematic crisis of the European Union is the product of decades of following a neo-functionalist philosophy whereby European leaders have assumed that greater economic integration will then lead to greater political integration, which will then lead to people feeling European, that people won't identify as Portuguese or Polish, but as European. Now, as a consequence of this ideology, in the 1990s, in the aftermath of the Soviet Union breaking apart, Europe expanded too quickly. not in terms of territory, but in terms of how much power and influence it had. And the European Union, from 1993 onwards, took on a lot of the responsibilities of a state, issuing a currency, creating foreign ministries, but it's only halfway formed. So it's got some of the powers of a state, and it doesn't have the legitimacy of a state yet. So in the eyes of tens of millions of Europeans, the EU is not an alliance anymore, it's not a state. A lot of Europeans are looking at Europe as basically an empire of unelected technocrats in Brussels who tell countries what to do. Now the reality is somewhat different, but the popular perception for tens of millions of people is that this is an external interloper.
It's hubris, isn't it?
There is a great degree of hubris, and unfortunately we're now going to move on to the second stage of nemesis, that the European Union grew so large, so fast, that it doesn't have the democratic legitimacy which is necessary for those powers to be respected by European populations. What we saw in Brexit was people voting en masse for a rejection of the EU as much as it was a rejection of the current general status quo. And we've also seen that not only in peripheral countries like Greece and Italy, but in the very core itself.
Do talk to each other. Leave me out sometimes. So what do you want to say, Julia?
No, I completely agree that it is a risky situation for the EU at the moment, and that there is absolutely the last, let's say, in this century, what we've seen even with the Lisbon Treaty, this was not managed very well. We have seen more integration without really making this an inclusive project and making the general public feel excluded to some extent. I think
we're going to have to go to Brussels in just a second.
Yeah,
carry on.
I would say there is a bit of an issue when it comes to the Council, for example, member states being too careful in actually creating political debate and being too worried about really engaging with this. And that's why you then have this idea that the Council is basically just a black hole where decisions are being made. And then our own governments are unaccountable, and that's what people are frustrated about.
I'll have to stop you here because I do want to bring Pieter back in. Okay, Pieter, the suggestion is perhaps that it grew too big for its own good. That's a position that you've supported. Is it time now, if it is going to reform, to rethink what point it has arrived at and to which point it should return, perhaps as far back as simply becoming a massive trading area as it was when it was the European Economic Community?
Yes, I think indeed we should go in that direction of going back to the original idea, where the European Union still has a lot of legitimacy. The EU has had great success in opening up markets. For example, ordinary people could take the plane to go on holiday to do business, something that is actually really an achievement of the EU. So I think if Brussels would focus on that, on making sure people can easily buy a car, another member state can buy services, I think it would really win back the hearts of Europeans. If it, however, would follow the agenda of the centralists, then I think indeed there will be a blowback.
Go back to trade,
Yeah.
go back to what the European European project, let's call it that, was supposed to be in the first place. Are there people you think in Brussels, and Brussels is sort of like a dirty word, isn't it, in most places, are there people in Brussels who are thinking that this is what must happen? Are they being realistic about it?
Well, I have to say it's a very 80s idea to go back to this, right? And let's think back to what were social policies and economic policies like in the 80s. They didn't really work for a lot of the population, right? And I think if we just think of the EU as opening up markets, being a neoliberal project, we will have exactly the same issues that we have now, because Brexit happened because you've had a lot of people being excluded from economic growth, excluded from globalization. If we simply push for an open market, liberal economic system, it's not going to make people happy. And so I don't think it's actually what people are asking for. If you say maybe let's have less political, a smaller political structure, that could make sense. But you still need some kind of social safeguard, some kind of social.
But what if you've got people who are, if you like, conceited, selfish, self-centered, see themselves as, you know, the future leaders of Europe, and they still believe that this should be done, and yet the population, by and large, is against it, and at least public opinion appears to be largely against it. Well, where do you go then?
This is the biggest problem, as much as I am very pro-EU, I'm also very pessimistic about its future, and I fear that it's now too late for the European Union. There are only two directions it can go in if it's going to reform. One is to return to being the EEC of the 1970s and 80s, but you can't unmake history, and we can't expect European politicians...
No, but you can design a better car if you take a look at the faults of the first one.
You can, but we can't expect European bureaucrats, leaders, people employed by the union to vote themselves out of a job in order to return back to the EEC, which had its own problems. The alternative is, as was mentioned from Brussels, concentrating even more powers in Brussels. The EU is currently halfway between an economic alliance and a state. It's only got half of the powers, so the way to save it is to concentrate even more power in Brussels. But can you imagine politicians in EU countries telling their Eurosceptic populations that we're going to surrender even more powers to an unelected technocracy?
Yeah, so you're saying it's neither one thing nor the other at the moment. If it has to succeed, it has to become either an earlier version of itself or a complete version.
Exactly, exactly. It has to
you don't think that's likely, though, do you?
I think it's going to take much too long, and the human element of that is that people are not going to vote themselves out of a job. So it's got to go back or forwards, but it's going to take too long.
Is it as self-centred as that there are people on the gravy train who don't want the train to stop?
I think it's actually... Obviously, you have that, but you also, as I said earlier, I think it's a lot about the governments we have in the European Union. And if the member states are not willing to actually engage with each other in a serious way, I think that's going to be a huge issue. Because if we, this reflex Franco-German integration project that simply we're now going to have this motor between Berlin and Paris again. It's not, it is obviously motivating for a lot of pro-EU analysts, but at the same time, if you exclude the South and the East and you don't make this an inclusive project, it's going to alienate people.
Exactly. This is the problem with the two-speed Europe which is being proposed, that it will create two different European unions in which the French and the Germans get all of the benefits and make all of the decisions, while the Hungarians and the Poles and the Greeks have to abide by the rules but don't get a say in it.
Yeah, it's like, and how do you get promoted to the Premier League? I mean,
precisely, and then we'll see countries following in Britain's footsteps.
Can I put this out?
I wouldn't agree with that. But
this is exactly where I was going. Okay, Britain is going, in brackets, but I think Britain is going. When you come to the next signs we should look for of Europe as a project crumbling, where do you think those signs are going to come from? Julie, you first.
Well, I don't really see Poland, for example, leaving the European Union. I think it's a very difficult political situation in Poland at the moment, but they just have too much to lose, and they would find themselves back between the EU and Russia, just where they don't want to be, and they didn't want to be for a very long time. I do think, though, that means that we need a much more comprehensive and inclusive discussion with states that are difficult or perceived as difficult from other member states. And that takes a lot of time. And I agree that's a risky process. It could potentially weaken the EU in the short term, but I think in the long term it would be beneficial.
Okay, any other?
I agree. Paradoxically, the Eastern European Eurosceptics are the ones who won't leave. If we take, say, Viktor Orban in Hungary, he gets so much political capital from blaming everything on the EU that if Hungary leaves, he's got no one left to blame.
All right, so maybe look further.
I think we should look at the
West,
Mediterranean. The next litmus test of European identity and pro- or anti-Europeanism is going to be the Italian elections when they come up.
Which very relatively soon.
Which are quite soon. Now, we've already seen in nearby countries. In Austria, we've got a very far-right party has emerged. France, we saw Le Pen getting into the final round of presidential elections, and the Italians already have problems of separatism and Euroscepticism. So we should be looking at the Mediterranean countries who have been hardest hit by austerity and hardest hit by the migration crisis.
So what about Spain? Because we have the Catalonia movement. I know it's a Spanish problem, but if it comes to pass that there is autonomy or independence declared there, then that's another little bit of mortar out of the European brick.
Independence was declared, and that demonstrated to all sides in the faction, all sides across Europe, that the EU was not capable of protecting people's rights. Because as much as the EU made bold comments about Brexit, the Crimean referendum, the Kurdish referendum, they were silent on the Catalan referendum, and this alienated both sides in Spain and alienated a lot of people across Europe.
It's getting weaker and weaker. Do you think it'll still be around in our grandchildren's lifetimes?
I think so, yes. I think the EU is very good at muddling through. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing, but I think what we should focus on more is on the real political changes that we see in Europe, and this rise of populism, the division between different political factions, because that affects both member state and the EU. And
I'm going to have to stop it.
Yeah.
Yeah? Thank you very much indeed. It's simply a matter of time. Muddling through, you wonder whether that is in fact the best that a multi-billion-dollar organisation can manage, and if that is the best it can manage, whether in fact it's worth its salt at all. Listen, a little bit like the European project, elements of our project today seem to fall off the cliff. Apologies for losing our guest in Brussels, but we got a large part of what Peter had to say. And my thanks to the two guests here at the table. This round table discussion about the European project. Will it live? How much time has it got left if it's doomed? That's it from me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.